So I've been stuck on where to begin. What is interesting, which is interesting because you'll see halfway through this talk, I read from the Book of Creation, aka the beginning, as a place to think about Madeline's work. Having just revisited Lucy Ives' book, the saddest thing is that I had to use words. A compilation of Madeline's writing, she also reflects. I've thought for a while about where to begin. The writer, artist, and architect Madeline Gins did so much during her lifetime in spheres of literacy, philosophical, visual, and environmental, and in between, that to begin at any single beginning feels disingenuous, if not downright inaccurate. So I will simply say that Madeline Gins was born in New York City in the midst of the Second World War and raised in Long Island. She went to study Eastern philosophy and physics at Barnard. In the mid-1960s, while studying painting at the Brooklyn Museum of Art, she met, collaborated with, and in 1965 married, Japanese-born artist Arakawa. Her work with Arakawa on the Reversible Destiny Architect project spanned decades, and it's there that I met her without Arakawa and what happened to be the last years of her life. Esther. Esther is going to read and was one of the head architects at Reversible Destiny.
What is it that wants to live as this organism? What is this that wants to live as this organism? What is its wants to live as this organism? What are these that want to live as this organism? What are these that want to live as this organism? What is its wants to live as this organism? What is this that wants to live as this organism? What is it that wants to live as this organism?
Thank you. After seeing an ad for an artist assistant at Reversible Destiny, I called the number, in which I reached Madeline. She asked, "Are you radical enough to work here?" In which my response was yes. A few days later, I walked to 124 Houston Street from my Chinatown apartment on Broome. Reversible Destiny, the studio, as we've said a few times, of Arakawa and Gins, believed that the changes in bodily perception would lead to changes in consciousness. They developed architecture and constructed environments that challenged the body as a way to reverse our destinies. Madeline also developed a volume of terminology to describe their philosophy and pointed towards the question of medium. What form forms you? I worked with Madeline between 2011 to early 2014 on numerous projects. The first was the Reversible Destiny Funhouse, an architectural proposal made with the country of Greece in mind. Madeline thought that the Greek art collector Dakis Giorno would fund it. Dakis was the owner of the super yacht Guilty. Its facade, a collaboration with Jeff Koons, ferried in his collection of pop art around the Mediterranean. The funhouse was planned to reform the human organism. As Madeline writes, a structure split with her process of world formation thus derailed. A person begins the processing of the environment more tentatively, cultivating, even cradling, tentativeness, the generative source of all thinking and feeling. To give you an idea of Madeline's terminology, here's a brief tour that lives alongside of her hypothetical building projects that all contribute to a new science called biotopology. Each person is a puzzle creature to him or herself. Person equals organism that persons. Their premise was that our bodies are co-linked, developed, and reliant on the built environment that we live within. They aren't just our bodies, but our architectural ones. Body proper plus the architectural surround equals the architectural body. A more expansive way of putting it, organism that persons plus tactfully posed surround equals the architectural body. It took me over a year working in her studio to understand a lot of these terms, so I understand if you can't grasp all of it right now. This is her only built work in America. It's in East Hampton, New York, on Long Island, and we're going to hear from her.
Dear and darling conference participants, hello, this is Madeline. Welcome. Our species has made a declaration. Let us call this the Reversible Destiny Declaration. We will not just take it anymore. We will no longer throw ourselves into the mortality wastebasket. Shall we put it in the following gentle but firm way? Oh yes, we shall. Enough is enough. We have decided not to die. And how do we go about doing this? Through architectural procedures made explicitly to help us reconfigure ourselves. If you do not yet know what an architectural procedure is, you will know soon. Start with this declaration and never back away from it. We have decided not to die.
Okay, so here are some of the procedures to give you an idea of how not to die. And so these procedures were prescriptive for entering into her architecture, and we can do a little of a case study around one of them. We can take disperse to contrast. And here's the floor plans of the Bioscleve house, just to give you an idea of ways in which she planned it. I can think about what disperse to contrast means. I don't know if anyone has an idea of what that would mean in this environment. If anyone does, you can say anything. I don't know. I think with the disperse to contrast, I think about the terrain. A lot of it is for climbing, and some of it is flat. And so there's contrast between thinking about where there's tension and kind of cognizance around where you're stepping and places to rest, which she was often really, her and Arakawa developed a very sort of new science around this bumpy floor that was a special composite. There's also play with color and where things are located. Everything was sort of on angles or in places unexpected to heighten your sense of awareness, which could be sort of categorized as contrasting. She also left these kind of riddles. So this is the floor plan of the entire building, which also is sort of encased or encoded into parts of the architecture itself, as the table, as the ceiling. Perhaps here we can see the ambient kinesthesia procedure, which may mean that the terrain creates a body-wide awareness of parts of your body that are sensory organs. Crawling trains your central nervous system, so I'm just interpreting what this might mean. I also visited the Bioscleve house multiple times, once driving Vito Conchi there, often to kind of spar philosophically with Madeline, and she had a theory at the time that he would only act up around her because Arakawa wasn't there, which kind of... I also brought my college friends there, and we got to actually live or like stay for some time to enact some of the procedures, which was really helpful since all of it had been hypothetical before. I'm going to give a fast-paced tour of their other built work that mostly lives in Japan. This is the Nagi Museum of Contemporary Art. Madeline cites this tube held impeccable chi. A mirrored Zen garden formed the walls of the cylinder. This is the site of Reversible Destiny Euro Park. I heard that people have to wear helmets when traversing this because it sends their gravity so into a spin. And these are the Reversible Destiny lofts in Mitaka in memory of Helen Keller, a multi-residential work of procedural architecture. For Madeline's writing, why not do away with corporate body, the corporate body, in favor of the communal body? But are we not a communal body to begin with? For does not being a species equal being a communal body? This is a piece of writing that Madeline passed out in the streets of New York that contributed to something called Streetworks. It says, please finish these sentences and return this paper to Madeline Gins. Everything I receive will become part of a novel, the length of which will be determined by the number of replies sent. This is a group novel, a historical novel, an exploration of the nature of consciousness. This also summons the communal mind for a literary collaboration. As Ives mentioned, she is, in some sense, literalizing Roland Barthes' essay on the death of the author. Barthes calls for the writing to be a tissue of citations, referring back to the unknowable author of contents and reference, rather than a monolithic masterpiece. Nadine.
Re-a-gun a poem. Twinkle, twinkle, little star, in the fascist world apart. I think I wonder where you are. Dia fanas munded ski eye. Lapse, greed, lapse. Wonder what? We are trying to cement despair. 1982.
Thank you. Within the studio, I worked on letters to Jasper Johns, Arthur Danto, Hillary Clinton, and the country of Finland, which you'll experience later, among others, as Madeline's poetry transmuted into letter exchanges. I also helped design the perfume line Man Repellent, which was made to be scentless. Here's some sketches.
Man Repellent. It works paradoxically. If spraying on a touch of man repellent, it works paradoxically, could bring human, post-human, or transhuman men toward me, how beyond lovely that would be, Mommy.
Additionally, I helped her edit medical poems on the Krebs cycle, a biochemical process by which nutrients are broken down to release energy that gets stored in the form of ATP and waste products are released. We'll hear from Madeline.
Oxidation of pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A. Acetyl, an oxidized 2-carbon unit, with concomitant reduction of NOD. That's nicotine or nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide. Okay, so this oxidation of pyruvate to acetyl coenzyme A requires 3 different enzymes, 5 different coenzymes. To become active, enzymes must combine with coenzymes. A multi-enzyme complex, large enough to be visible in the electron microscope.
I thought a lot about what it meant to work in the studio of Arakawa+Gins without Arakawa and Absentia. I thought a lot about what artists make in the last chapter of their lives. These medical poems were a navigational point to molecular linguistics. How do we store energy? How do we process energy? It has everything to do with how the world works, which might mean its cycle is representative of a total sum of shared elements we as a species inject or process that leads to total transformation. Years later, I visited Martin Wong's retrospective at the Queen's Museum and noted his final works. After his rise to fame in the 1980s, rendering imagery of the Lower East Side, mixed with various writing systems, poetry, and astrological signs, he was now making compositions of potted plants. What becomes the resting punctuation for radical mind? Returning to the idea of collaborative writing, I immersed myself in the studies of Jewish apocalyptic literature and mysticism throughout the years, thinking a lot about how the Book of Creation has been written by many hands through time and authored under a eponymous name of God. The Sefer Yetzirah, also known as the Book of Creation, is one of the foundational texts of Jewish mysticism. It says that the world and the text are the same, or that God creates the world out of Hebrew letters. The letters are used to create physical things. It is part of a mathematical and linguistic theory that becomes enacted into a form of spoken creation. As the slide says, the human practitioner who undertakes the combination ritual also enters into a mythic reality where intentional speech becomes real. As one makes all possible combinations, one invokes the creation of all things in the cosmos. We might say that we are reinforcing the universe, adding our own intention to the unfolding of creation. With each combination, we honor each part of creation and strengthen the whole. Here, the letters create a visual of a wheel that cycles back and forth. The Sefer Yetzirah recommends the recitation of the combination of all Hebrew letters. It considers the Hebrew alphabet to be the divine name, so reciting the permutations of the alphabet unlocks divine powers. This practice can be visual, seeing the combination of the 2 letters. It can be verbal, sound, the combination of the letters, or it can be through the writing of the letters, thus engraving them as God does in the book itself, or it can be all 3. Here are more maps that visualize speculations concerning God's creation of the world through letters and form. The God who manifests himself is the God who expresses himself. These letter webs remind me of the mechanism of meaning, Arakawa+Gins' seminal series of diagrammatic paintings breaking down meaning-making structures elementally. Despite Madeline's ardent atheism, she's not confined to it. Her ideas speak towards a Jewish mystical tradition. Oh, I want to introduce you, sorry. Anu worked at the studio as well, and they were defined as an expert optimist, a viability researcher, an organism that persons, as opposed to an organism that dogs, and a puzzle creature.
Thank you. Maker between above and below. Where edges blink eddies, the texture of deceivability by vectors may saturate. Pieces of layered approximations receive the surfacing of the parallel drift, generating a sense of out and in, angular spin. The depth maker of the surface, distance of time, freehold, tunneling volumes of degrees as if broken tubes. Within but between the numbers being counted, the setting of a broken rail. The enormous movability of a sucking passage, omnidirectional, random, partial shrinking. Appearance of some profile junctures, some linear burps, many volumes exchanged, a speed of sifting. Place for construction of a core of flexibility, only diffuse receding which parallels and contours weighting texture. The unique range of elasticities of impressionable stretching, not yet texture. The regulating of reflection, deflection, inflection. Coalescence of sound joints, guides, realization of mounting, and push of duration, instinctly. Both senders and receivers, configurational coverings on all and any scale, full of breath. To keep the end in sight, balance. As always, the necessity of out of the blue, to and from. A sudden drop in the scale of action, the call of continuity. Thank you, Madeline.
Thank you. This baby that lives on posters in the studio felt like Madeline's version of the Vitruvian Man. She would say, "You took a million years to form. We are now able to speak. There's something in the universe that wants us to speak." She goes on to write, and I'm quoting from a newly published article called "What is Word Rain" by Daniela Senator. If writing is to become alive again, this is what Madeline said, if writing is to become alive again, words must truly be subordinate to image and idea through art. As a systemic, though whimsical investigation, we don't need any more good writers, word shufflers. That's why some of the most interesting writing today is done by bad writers in scientific or philosophic journals, or artists like Duchamp, Picabia, or Arakawa, who write with words as objects, or vice versa. Here, Gins is placing her own work in an expansive and distinctly interdisciplinary network of others who approach language in service of a broader material, spatial, political, or metaphysical goal. If I can summon Jewish mysticism one last time, I'd like to read the beginning of the Zohar. The Zohar, which means splendor or radiance, is a foundational work of Kabbalistic literature. It is a group of books, including the commentary on the mystical aspects of the Torah. In the beginning, when the will of the king began to take effect, he engraved signs in the heavenly sphere that surrounded him, within the most hidden resources of a dark flame to issue from the mystery of the infinite, like a fog forming in the unformed, enclosed in a ring of that sphere, neither white nor black, neither red nor green, of no color whatsoever. Only after this flame began to assume size and dimension did it produce radiant colors. From the innermost center of the flame sprang forth a well, out of which the colors issued and spread upon everything beneath, hidden in the mysterious hiddenness of the infinite. Beyond this point, nothing can be known. Therefore, it is called the beginning, the first word out of 10, by means of which the universe has been created. Here, Arakawa and Gins have rendered what they call critical resemblances, or the concept of the critical holder, who is surrounded by landing sites. Landing sites register the location position relative to the body, that then help us hold a sense of the world. Okay, and this I'm premiering. It's never been seen before. I wore a head camera to the studio for a period of time because I was really obsessed with emergent technologies. And this captured the studio at work, helping to write to the country of Finland.
Makers make it through, but eventually they don't. makers learn to be makers from other makers. I had said before that those who are not stymied or impeded in their making will not want to die. They will not want to commit suicide. People who are not stymied or impeded in their making will not desire to commit suicide. Procedural architecture makes it possible for those, if there's tension in the amazing path, it's harder for that they get there. It's like going through the gold coast of your intention. Like there's an intention, you're going to go through it. And this helps you through it. Does anybody feel that? Oh, you should speak. That's something that would do better. So, speak and move your hand if you feel that. Just say something.
I'm holding. I can feel it. I can feel it in the calm of my head.
So, do you want to hear it again? Then just we'll play it now, and then someone will say it. Okay, and even if people say at the same time, who cares? Even that they get the one that's we have decided that the diagram we should take off from you. Read enough? Why that? Yeah. Figuring out how not to die is figuring out what lives of our species go hand in hand, transing with hands in human hand. How can you permit ourselves to become the makers that we need to become?
No need to migrate. No need to migrate.
No need to migrate? Okay. Why?
Because we can use something, better, or something else. Dear morose Finland, you don't need to migrate just yet, because we can bring you something better. Something else, something other.
But how is that possible? You say to us, I have no son. How can you make it better for me? You are the son.
How am I the son?
You will teach us to think the son. And how will you do that? Son will be. This is the sun. Right here.
I believe part of the mantra of Arakawa+Gins is "we have decided not to die" lives as a mode of repetition of letter, word, procedure that once repeated, published, rendered, and built creates an act of immortality. The reading of their words, the publishing of their books, and the sharing of their work is a form of their life extension. Thank you, Charlotte, for the opportunity to continue their mantra. I love and miss Madeline, her precision of language, the ambiguity at times of its meaning, her multidimensional practice that couldn't bear linear readings and so expanded to fill the walls, the tables, the in-between space. It's forever shaped the way I am, a maker. And I'd just like to share as an aside, in 2020, I created a piece called Queen City Special, which manifested as a model train track moving between exhibition walls, containing figures of contemporary and historical characters reproduced in miniature. The status of an icon as an embodiment of what is holy and praised is reconstituted, and in particular, individuals marginalized or invisibilized or forgotten by society ride in joyous circles. Here's Esther with her child, her daughters, and one of them is named Madeline, after Madeline. She got to visit her namesake in miniature. And I'll leave you with this video.
Who took the bomb? Every day
sort of trying to figure out in the last year and a half is why Madeline wasn't better known during her lifetime. And it was really interesting during the 80s and 90s in particular. She was often categorized only as a poet and never as an artist. And there's a kind of infamous review in the New York Times by Roberta Smith of a show, an exhibition on the work of Arakawa+Gins that was at the Guggenheim in 1997, where Roberta refuses to acknowledge Madeline as an artist. The sort of message of her review is, poets should stick to poetry, artists should stick to art, and neither should venture into architecture. She really did not like the show. And I mean, yeah, Madeline's work was obviously very cross-disciplinary, but I think in a way that, I think that she actually just rejected the boundaries altogether. And I think she did that in a way that made a lot of people uncomfortable, maybe. So I guess, Pamela, you've been working across mediums for many years, and I'm curious whether you both think that Madeline's attempts to work sort of between or outside of disciplines altogether might have contributed to her lack of recognition, and I guess your own experience as artists working between mediums, and whether those categorizations between poet and artist still exist, if it's changed over time.
Well, when I finish a couple of books, I'm going to write a book of essays on art and my experiences in art, and it's called "It's All Poetry to Me." And so, I mean, I want to address specifically this idea of the interdisciplinary and all the categories. I think that for a long time, the art world wanted to place people in boxes. I think our world wanted to place people in boxes. And I feel like in the last 10, 15, 20 years, like that may be loosening up. A lot of the degree programs that I work in, like they now say interdisciplinary, cross-pollination, right? I mean, it's kind of strange because like in literature, like Shakespeare, they love to quote Shakespeare, but Shakespeare was interdisciplinary, right? But for some reason, Toni Morrison was interdisciplinary. I mean, she wrote plays and all these different things, but people did not really want to recognize it, right? And I don't know. I think that's because their imaginations are very limited. I think it corresponds kind of with Western thinking and this kind of like mind, body, spirit split, you know? And so that we're meant to compartmentalize everything that we do, and they say that it's simpler. And so of course the fact that she worked across disciplines, I think also, you know, kept her out of being like recognized, right? A lot of times people can't accept me, you know, working outside of poetry, right? They're just like, you're a poet, right? And I'm like, well, I just did this visual. Well, you're a poet, right? You know what I mean? Or they get really panicked, right? You're still writing poetry, right? You know, yeah, sure. You know what I mean? But they are all interrelated. I mean, I even think in terms of like visual art, like there's not one visual artist that you can like sort of like look at historically and not find a poet. Right, so there's always a relationship between language, between the visual art, and then, you know, how do you categorize these things? And of course there's a relationship to architecture, right? So yes, I think that was a huge contribution, but also the fact that she was like a woman, you know, and you know, and basically the art world for a long time it was about men, you know. So in that regard, I think that all those factors kind of contributed.
Yeah, I echo that. Yeah, I think that her practice of illegibility, of living in ambiguity, of not having sort of a central subject that people can come to know and understand, obviously limits the ability for people to place her. It's also just like sort of the accumulation of, I don't know, a need for, or a capitalist sort of intention to kind of cite someone and brand them and then like know them to then sell them. And I think that for artists that are working through different mediums and having more complex sort of relationships to them, it's extraordinarily hard to do that with. And so I think there's that. And also I think in a more private way, she wasn't really outward facing. She was prolific working in the studio for 3.5 years was working all the time and iterations of each single detail. Like every image I showed you probably had 100 images before that to get that image even not to be published, since most weren't. The first visual that I started with, Alive, if not now but when, or I'm getting that wrong, is a volume, or her last book that she never published. So a lot of work remained in the studio. She wasn't sort of outward facing. A lot of artists in New York now are very outward facing and like networking and nepotism, and there's so many like formulas for people to be known. And she wasn't grounded there. She was really in her work with her husband and the studio, sort of manifesting this vision that wasn't just for art, it was for world building and for a future that is like a lot bigger than, you know, New York City.
Yeah, it's also interesting to think about the sort of like, there's always been a major sort of commercial difference between poetry and art, in that poetry has a much lower market value generally than art does. And that's something that like Charles Bernstein, who knew Madeline very well, talks a lot about. And even when poets begin collaborating with artists, like the value of the work goes down, which I think is really interesting. Market value. I wanted to speak a little bit more about humor, because I think that's something that Madeline does really, really beautifully. She sort of melds seriousness with humor. And I guess one thing to touch on is I think sometimes people don't maybe understand that they really believed in what they said, and when they said that they were not going to die, it wasn't sort of like, people have asked me if it's like a long-term performance piece or something like that, but it was serious and it was real in a lot of ways. And so I think it's really interesting to think about that, but also there's something to be said for the way that Madeline could take these serious concepts like death or like a chemical reaction or politics, and then add her sort of like strange humor into it. I mean, What the President Will Say and Do is a book that I think makes people laugh out loud. When you listen to her readings, people are laughing in the audience. Yeah, so I'm curious, I guess, how you both reacted to What the President Will Say and Do when you first read it, and yeah, what you think of the sort of humor in her work and the importance of it.
I think like my first reaction was panic. Like I just felt like, okay, what is she doing here? And then, you know, I don't know, a couple of pages in, I was like, oh, okay, I get it. And it's interesting because it's a very complex process, you know, that in a way she sort of, I mean, I was like reading all this stuff about her, and they were saying that like she sort of like breaks down this idea between the author and the audience, and you know, like sort of like activates all of these things. And then I think she also like literalizes things to like kind of like get the metaphor, right? So it's like, it's a very strange process, but it's really brilliant, I think, and I think it's really unique. And I definitely was hooked when she said something about revolution, and I was like, yes, no, yeah, she's my person, you know. And I think that she revolutionizes language. I think that yeah, the humor. I mean, I write with humor a lot. I mean, I think it's important to kind of like convey some really, you know, deep stuff, you know, because a lot of times people they won't necessarily take the heaviness of the topic, but if you can, you know, sort of like make it humorous, but also she sort of like points fun at our language too, like the things that we say, you know, like in one of them with the leader, I think it was the leader 1 or 2, it's like he had to finish scraping and then he was like, I'll answer the call, you know, or he put his penis on top of like something. Like a bookmark. I don't know. You know what I mean? So there are all these odd things that like kind of like made you laugh out loud. But I was also thinking about theater, and one of the things that has been really important in terms of training is that everybody has like kind of like memorized a script, right? Like memorize a script in their head. And then, you know, if you're the director, you kind of like have, it's your job to sort of jog them out of it, right? So you gotta like take away everything that they've memorized and get them to see the text anew, right? And so I thought of that a lot when I was reading her, that like she basically like really kind of like assaults our expectations of language, and then it can get us to like look at something differently, to see something different, to see the humor in it, or the ridiculousness, or, you know what I mean? So yeah.
While you were talking, I remembered I drove Vito Aconci and Madeline to the Biosleep house as their chauffeur, and with Vito's 20-year-old wife at the time. And Madeline's first question to Vito was, "What's your middle name?" And he was like, "Hannibal." And it just like kind of escalated in that car ride around, like she is a I can't say the word right now, provocateur. And yeah, she likes to kind of like hit people from the side and see how they'll react. And she would tell stories about when Arakawa, prior to meeting her, I think this is true, I don't know if it's lore, that was dating Yoko Ono, and she had left a lot of robes in his studio, and so Madeline would wear the robes to Yoko's openings. And she would always have these dinner parties in the 1960s where people had dinner parties as art, where she would invite everyone that was vegan to like a rabbit stew. Like she was just, I think that like it's integral to the ways in which she lived in the world, and the world isn't. And I was thinking about this a lot with like who gets to make this work, and obviously it has to do with time, who has access to time. Her building that she lived in and owned was a sardines factory that on Houston that her mother bought for her, and so she lived, you know, in this building for 50 years for low cost, and so she was allowed to dream a lot, and for a long time and employ a lot of people to dream with her. And so I think that this work, she got to like really kind of create something that, or access something that we often can't because of time. And I think even in the quote around like we don't need any more good writers, word shufflers, we need bad writers. I think poetry, it's like poetry wasn't enough, you know, poetry was just the beginning. And then she was like, that's a volume that I need to fill larger. And so she went to like installations or drawings or paintings. And then she went to, architecture, she said, was the end of philosophy. Like, how do we actually enact the thoughts that we believe? And so it's just like all these volumes are really interesting for me to think about in terms of her practice, and humor obviously is one of them. And also Vito was like a poet architect. Like he also was someone from that tradition in which they actually didn't get along at all. But yeah.
Sort of going off of that, Aviva, you brought up Man Repellent in your presentation, and I think Man Repellent was maybe the most popular work in the exhibition space. Everyone loved it. And I don't know if you said this, but my understanding is that it was conceived to be a product that was sold in museum stores. Is that right? I'm curious, I want to hear more about it, and I want to know like how the project came about, if there really were going to be like other lines of it, and then why it was never realized, if you have an answer.
I don't know if any of you guys back there a memory. I was assigned, I guess, more of the design project of Man Repellent, and she wanted to include 3 different kinds of balls, like sport ball. Anyway, as the design, as the logo, and she also on the back wanted cracked glass with a bead of blood, and I had to I had to scan my own blood to put on the back of the label. I think, like a lot of projects in the studio, they were never finished, which is in keeping with not dying. They just remained in limbo, which I think as a 25-year-old, it was extremely excruciating to put a lot of effort into something that never came to be. I made 100 bottles that sat on the desk. And I had called up a bunch of, I thought museum stores would maybe sell them, but we didn't pursue that. We just, and she wasn't interested in a scent, which I think people were disappointed by.
Okay, maybe that's a good place to open it up to the audience. If anyone has any questions.
Aviva, the video you showed where you're collaborating on the letter to Finland, can you like talk more about what you were doing there and like how Madeline, because you're 25 and you get like dropped. I mean, this is like a very bizarre universe. Like, does she like, does she, I was gonna say groom, that's not what I meant to say, but like, does she like teach you her language? Like, how do you like join the fray?
It felt like Survivor. So she hired 20 people at one time. Like after Arakawa passed away, I think she was just spiraling out of control with how to maintain reversible destiny, and so she hired a lot of people. And not everyone was well-intentioned, so it just became this sort of battleground for people's intentions in being there. It was just a really odd environment of colliding with a lot of people and her work and her sort of like work ethic, which was like modulated through another person that managed us. And that person would write notes of like what we needed to do across many different sticky notes. Like it would be one word across like 20 different notes. Like so there wasn't like an organizational system where we were like explained on her process, but we did sit around the big table often, and a lot of I've lived with writers as well, and a lot of writing, or the practice of writing, is to speak it out loud and see how it lands, and for people to like add commentary. And so we would sit and listen to her and then contribute, and so it became sort of like this like cosplay of Madeline. Like we would all be different Madelines. Like I would be like Madeline 11, and so we would just kind of have an emergent voice that was then contributing to the voice of the work. And so it would be for like Arthur Danto or Jasper Johns, who was having like a really hard depressive time, and so she wanted to save his life, and so we all had to speak to Jasper as our friend and contribute optimism. Oh, and also she was against linearity, and so when you see all the papers everywhere in the studio, she wanted to be able to access all her writing at once. So it was a way for her to write in 3D, if you were curious.
Any other questions?
I guess I'm curious if her writing process, if anyone could speak to her writing process, if it remained the same throughout her life, like in terms of if she wrote word rain and like what the president was saying, do it in the same way with like a group of 20 people or yeah.
That's a great question. I'm not positive on this, but I know that Word Rain was 1969. It was very early on. So this was like before she had the sort of studio and I believe before she had like a large amount of assistants. And also like she wrote and studied poetry at Barnard, and sort of in those years I think was just writing a lot. But for example, like, you know, her last book that was never published, was that collaborative in any way? You know? Alive if not alive if not forever, but when?
I think it was a lot of writing that already lived in different forms, and perhaps it was filtered through some conversations that were either with us or other people. But she did a lot of it on her own as well. I think the letters to other people were often collaborative, and then maybe some other projects that were maybe long form were less collaborative.
Yeah. But also like the idea of like collaborative writing was clearly something she was thinking about very early on with like the sort of fill in the blanks that Aviva presented on. Like that was a performance from 1969. So yeah, the concept was there, definitely.
Carl.
Can I
Oh yeah.
So I spent a lot of time with Madeline in her writing, and she was really involved with the concrete poetry movement and just like a lot of writers who were downtown. So even like when she was aging, we would go and she would like workshop the writing from the studio. You know, I think it was like always in process and like always like thinking about how to interact with words with people. Amazing.
Harley?
Aviva, can you talk more about 3D writing? I saw what I think are Japanese clothes drying, the pins in the circles all about the table. And after that, I would love to hear from Pamela if you're if you've done 3D writing, or does this interest you?
Yeah, it's kind of what it looks like. Like she would just have all parts of her book sort of layered, so she could kind of grab a paper at will and be able to read it. Whereas like on a computer, you have to scroll in a linear fashion. And I think she wanted sort of the happenstance of coming upon a page, maybe not in order that could be reordered. So it was more about just having access to a breadth of writing.
I don't know if this will answer your question. I haven't necessarily done it, but you know, I teach across disciplines at Columbia, and I mean, it's interesting because it's in the visual program, and people are so creative with regard to visual art, but like they have a very set idea about the book. And they're like, okay, and so they're gonna do these beautiful paintings, this installation, and then they're like, and then I'm gonna do a little book. And I'm like, well, why are you gonna do a book? You know, and I'm the poet, right? But I feel like people have no sort of inventiveness around language and how it's sort of like viewed, right? And how it's shown. And so in that regard, like I'm always encouraging people, like I always want like the book form to be the last form that anyone chooses, right? It's like, what else can you do with it? What can you do with these pages? Like why would you just, you know, but I mean, it's interesting that we're taught to innovate so many things, but like, you know, and then everybody's like, I'm gonna do a little book. I'm gonna do a little zine, you know? And like, okay, well, can you put it on the wall? Can you kick it? I mean, what can you do with it? You know what I'm saying? So I've long been wanting to sort of like liberate the book form, right? Yeah, because I feel like we're not creative about it at all. It's starting to change a little bit, but not enough.
Okay. Oh, there, yeah.
For Aviva, I think you spoke about this a little, or you said one thing about why Madeline kind of transitioned into doing architecture, but I was wondering if you have like more thoughts on that. Like, I was curious what her first sort of like architectural project was like, and what sort of pushed her or innovated her through her other practices to explore spatial creation.
I'm not her historian, so I'm like, I don't know the evolution exactly. I know that through their major retrospective at the Guggenheim called it was the We Have Decided Not to Die book. A lot of their paintings were sculptural, like there was a lot of elements added, and then there was a lot of platforms and sort of like obstacle courses to then view the work. So it became more spatialized, and I feel like that was sort of a setup or a process towards how do we sort of enact these mechanisms of meaning in a way that's not just flat. And because she was against flatness, I could only imagine that those paintings could only exist for so long. But I don't know like all the steps towards architecture. Yeah.
Was there mourning? I'm sorry if it's not clear. You mentioned at some point 20 assistants being hired. Right? Was there mourning?
Like mourning, like grieving.
NJ, rather than the thing that happens after dawn.
Grieving.
Grieving like after Madeline's death, or?
No, after her partner died.
Do you have?
Yes.
And maybe I'm just curious how that was affecting practice or the.
I mean, I think it was a pretty private experience, and I think because of their sort of immortality stance, it wasn't something focused on. Like, I didn't know where Arakawa went. You know, I didn't know where or what happened, and it wasn't spoken about. So it was a private experience, and I did find, and I showed a letter to Arakawa, and she did write to him, and there are more writings to him in letter form and poetry around grieving him. But yeah, I think that it wasn't something that was publicized or public or even seen often beyond maybe experiences where we were left to wonder in his absence, because he did obviously take up a monolithic space in the practice as being her life partner and working partner.
Yeah, I would just add that there's Madeline wrote like a series of what she labeled unfinished letters, and a lot of them are about Arakawa and I think about that grieving process, and those are available online in PDF form, and they're really beautiful if you're interested. Yeah. Okay, maybe that's a good place to stop. Thank you, everyone.